Okay, so it is February 1st, 2026. And I'm scrolling through the international feeds this morning. And, if you're looking at the map of Eastern Europe, it feels a little like Groundhog Day.
Hmm.
The headlines are all Belarus. Following the 2025 elections, Alexander Lukashenko is securing his seventh term in office.
Right.
And the pundits are churning out all the usual takes, talk of spheres of influence, the last dictatorship, the same narratives we've heard for 30 years.
Yeah.
But looking at the source material we have today, I get the sense that focusing just on the man himself, maybe that's missing the point.
Well, it's the classic mistake, isn't it? It's looking at the waves
Yeah.
and, completely ignoring the ocean currents underneath.
Yeah.
We see the election results or the protests or the crackdowns. We think that's the whole story. But if you really want to understand why Belarus is where it is in 2026, you have to look at the timeline differently.
Right, and that's exactly why I was so excited to dig into this specific stack of research, because we aren't just looking at political commentary, we're applying a historical framework that's usually reserved for dusty academic halls. The Annales School. Well, specifically, the ideas of Fernand Braudel. Now, I know that it sounds heavy, but his whole philosophy was that history isn't just, who beat whom in a battle. It's about layers of time.
Exactly. Braudel argued that events, like an election or a treaty, they're just surface froth.
Right.
They're flashy,
Yeah.
but they don't really move the needle much.
Yeah.
To understand a country's destiny, you have to look deeper. You have the conjuncture.
These medium-term cycles?
Right, the economic or social cycles that last maybe a few decades.
Mhm.
And at the very bottom, you have the Longue Durée.
The geography.
The geography, the stuff that hasn't changed since, the Ice Age.
So the mission for this deep dive is pretty clear then. We're going to ignore the breaking news ticker for a second and dissect Belarus through these three layers. We'll start with the dirt itself, the geography move up to the economy, the factories, and then finally look at the mentality of the people, because the argument here is fascinating. Is Belarus's reliance on Russia a political choice made by one guy, or is it a structural inevitability?
It's the difference between a captain steering a ship and the current that's pulling the ship. Braudel would say we need to look at the current.
Okay, so let's start with that deep current, the Longue Durée. I was looking at the topographical maps in the briefing, and it's striking. If you look at Belarus, there's nothing.
Mhm.
And I don't mean that as an insult, I mean literally. There are no mountains, there are no canyons. It's just this massive flat extension of the North European plain.
It is a vast plain, and that single geographical fact is probably the most important thing about the country. Braudel calls this structural necessity.
Structural necessity.
Because there are no natural borders, no Pyrenees, no English Channel.
Nothing to protect.
Nothing. Belarus is destined to be a transit route. It is a hallway without doors.
A hallway between the East and the West.
Precisely. And throughout history, being a hallway is, well, it's a dangerous job. You are either a trade route or you are an invasion highway.
There's no middle ground.
No. And if you look at the hydrography, the water flow gets even more interesting. You have the Dnieper flowing south to the Black Sea and the western Divina flowing north to the Baltic.
Which creates that ancient trade route, right? The path from the Varangians to the Greeks. It's been a crossroads for 1,000 years.
It has. But think about the security implication of that. If you are a flat crossroads with rivers that let armies move easily north, south, east, and west, you cannot defend yourself alone.
You don't have the luxury of, say, Switzerland.
No, you can't just hide in the Alps and declare neutrality.
So this leads to that concept of geographic determinism that the sources bring up. The idea that because the land is indefensible, Belarus must attach itself to a great power to survive. It's not a choice, it's physics.
Right. It's about survival. Historically, they leaned on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth when that was the dominant power.
Sure.
For the last 2 centuries, the center of gravity has been Russia. The key insight here is that for a country like Belarus, sovereignty isn't about standing alone against the world. The source says it's about holding on to the least harmful side.
Wow. That's a grim way to put it. The least harmful side.
It is.
But it makes sense. If you're standing in an open field during a storm, you stand next to the biggest structure you can find.
Exactly. And in 2026, looking at the map, the structure that covers their flank is Russia. The West, historically, that has been the source of invasion, Napoleon, Hitler. The East has been the source of the umbrella.
So the geography sets the stage. It says, you will not be independent, you will be aligned.
Yes.
But I want to push back on this a little bit because, we live in 2026. We have drones, we have cyber warfare, we have global supply chains. Does flat land really dictate destiny anymore?
That's a fair challenge.
It feels a bit 19th century to say, oh, no mountains, guess we're Russian
And
allies.
I get that. But technology changes the tactics.
Yeah.
It hasn't really changed the strategic reality of being a buffer zone.
Mm.
If anything, modern warfare makes strategic depth even more valuable to a country like Russia. They need that 600 kilometers of flat Belarusian land to keep potential adversaries away from Moscow. The Longue Durée moves slowly.
Okay.
It takes more than a few decades of the internet to erase 10 centuries of geography.
Okay, so the land creates the pressure, but humans build on top of the land. And this brings us to that second layer, the conjuncture,
The medium-term cycles.
the economy. Because you can't talk about Belarus without talking about the Soviet legacy.
And this is where the trap really snaps shut. If geography is the stage, the Soviet Union built the set, and they built it to be an assembly line.
I love that analogy, the assembly line of the USSR.
I mean, think about it. The Soviet planners didn't want autarky. They didn't want each republic to be self-sufficient. They wanted integration. So Belarus was assigned the role of the final assembly shop. They built massive tractor factories, MTZ. They built huge oil refineries like Naftan. They built heavy machinery plants for defense.
But here's the kicker. I was reading the supply chain breakdown in the source. They don't have the stuff to run those factories. They don't have the oil. They don't have the gas. They don't have the metal.
Exactly. They have the machine, but Russia has the plug. It created this cycle of dependency that has now lasted for 70 years. To run the factory, you need Russian raw materials. Once you build the tractor, well, you need the Russian market to buy it.
Right,
You can't just suddenly pivot and sell a Soviet-spec tractor to, I don't know, California.
It's like the proprietary ink cartridge problem, but on a national scale.
That's a great way to put it.
You bought the printer, now you're stuck buying their ink forever. And what's fascinating is looking at this 2026-2030 economic program that just came out, you'd think maybe, just maybe, they'd try to diversify.
You would think. But the source material highlights the exact opposite. The new plan is all about synchronized modernization. They aren't trying to break the dependency, they are upgrading it.
Right. I saw the section on import substitution. They're focusing heavily on microelectronics in the defense industry. But, and this is the key, they're doing it with Russia.
That's the critical detail. By integrating their digital infrastructure and their high-tech defense manufacturing with Russia, they are locking themselves in even tighter.
So it's not just oil pipes anymore.
No, now it's about code and chips and supply chains for the Russian war machine.
So technology, which we think of as this disruptive force, is actually just reinforcing the conjuncture here. It's deepening the cycle.
It is.
And we had to talk about the human element of this economic cycle, too. The sources touch on the demographic trauma of World War II.
Oh, you can't overstate that. I mean, Belarus lost a quarter, maybe even a third of its population in WWII,
Yeah.
the Bloodlands.
Ugh.
And that level of devastation, it just destroyed the old social fabric, the mix of Jewish, Polish, and Catholic influences that sort of pulled toward the West. The rebuilding was entirely Soviet. It shifted the religious and cultural center of gravity toward orthodoxy and toward Moscow.
It created a society that equates safety with having a big protector,
It did.
which is a perfect segue to the top layer. We've done the dirt, we've done the factories. Now the evenementiel, the mentalities, the events. This is where we talk about Lukashenko, the Batka.
Batka, the father. You know, it's not just a nickname, it's an archetype. The Annales School would argue that political figures like Lukashenko don't just appear out of nowhere. They fill a mold that the society creates.
And the mold here is the partisan myth,
Yeah.
right? The idea of the strong leader who protects the people from the chaos of the outside world.
Precisely. Remember the geography, the invasion highway, remember the history, the devastation. The collective consciousness of Belarus, or at least the deep structure of it, has a profound fear of chaos.
So the alternative.
The alternative to Lukashenko isn't viewed by the silent majority, or at least the state apparatus, as liberal democracy. It's viewed as disorder.
But hold on. We saw 2020. We saw hundreds of thousands of people in Minsk demanding change. That wasn't a silent majority fearing chaos. That was a loud majority demanding a new future. Doesn't that shatter the partisan myth?
Oh, I challenged it, certainly. I mean, that was a massive event in the annals sense. But look what happened by 2026.
Right.
The source material argues that the deep structure, the state apparatus, the security services, and, of course, the Russian backing it, absorbed that blow. They managed to reframe the protests not as a democratic awakening, but as a foreign intervention. that threaten stability.
So they use the mentality of fear to crush the mentality of hope.
In a way, yes. By the time we get to this 2025 election and the start of the seventh term, the system has reset. The Annales view isn't that Lukashenko is some kind of magician, it's that the state engaged in a desperate search for continuity. The system protected itself because the alternative breaking away from Russia was structurally impossible given everything we just discussed.
Which brings us to the Union State. We hear this term thrown around constantly. Is it just a paper treaty, or is it the manifestation of this whole lock-in?
It's the formalization of fate.
Yeah.
But there's a fascinating tension in how the two sides view it. The sources use two very different metaphors. For Russia, Belarus is defense depth.
A buffer, a shield.
A buffer, a shield, exactly.
And for Belarus,
For Belarus, the source calls it a life buoy.
a life buoy. That
Yeah.
implies drowning.
It does. It implies that without the economic subsidies, without the cheap gas, without
Yeah.
the open market for their tractors, the Belarusian state would sink. They cling to Russia not necessarily out of ideological love, but out of existential necessity. The tragedy is that the life buoy keeps them afloat, but it also drags them wherever the swimmer decides to go.
And right now, that swimmer is heading into deeper, colder waters. So let's try to synthesize this. We are in February 2026. If we look at the scorecard provided in our briefing, what's the state of the nation?
Economically, they're projecting about 2.8% growth. On paper, that looks stable, but it's artificial growth driven entirely by military-industrial spending and Russian subsidies.
So the factory is running hot, but it's only making one product for one customer.
Exactly. Geopolitically, they are solidified as the stabilizer or the buffer in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. They are playing the role geography assigned them 1,000 years ago.
It really makes you question the concept of political agency. You know, we tend to look at countries and think, why don't they just choose to be like Estonia? Why don't they just pivot? But if you accept this Annals view, you realize those choices they're constrained by centuries of inertia.
There is a beautiful, if slightly haunting, metaphor the source uses to wrap this all up. It compares the history of the region to a river.
Okay, walk us through that.
So imagine a river that has been carving its path for a millennium. The water is deep, it's heavy. The events of the 2020s, the protests, the sanctions, the tweets, the speeches.
Oh, the noise.
All the noise. It's just ripples on the surface. It's turbulence. It looks dramatic. But it doesn't change the direction of the flow.
Because the riverbed is tilted.
The riverbed, the geography, the industrial legacy, the cultural trauma is tilted toward the east, toward Moscow. No matter how much the surface water splashes and tries to flow west toward the Baltic, the gravity of that riverbed just pulls it back.
That is incredibly fatalistic. It suggests that change is impossible.
Not impossible. But the Annales School would say that true change, structural change, takes centuries. It doesn't happen in one election cycle.
Right.
To change the direction of the river, you have to move the mountains, or in this case, completely rebuild the economic and social foundations of the country, which is a generational project.
And the 2026 plan we discuss is doing the exact opposite. It's dredging the old riverbed deeper.
That's the reality. Belarus is currently balancing its dreams of a European future because, let's not forget, the people, especially the youth, are connected to the world against this Russian axis reality. But right now, gravity is winning.
It really forces you to look at the headlines differently. When you see a handshake between leaders or a new trade deal, it's not just politics. It's the surface manifestation of these massive, grinding tectonic plates.
It is. And it teaches us to be patient with history. We want quick fixes. We want the good guys to win by the end of the movie. But history is a long, slow process of geography and economics asserting themselves.
So to recap for everyone listening, geography denied Belarus natural borders, making it a permanent hallway that needs a guard. The Soviet era built an industrial machine that only runs on Russian fuel. And the trauma of the 20th century created a deep-seated fear of chaos that the current leadership exploits to stay in power.
That is the Annals summary of Belarus in 2026, a prisoner of its own map and its own history.
It leaves us with a pretty heavy question to chew on then. If geography really is destiny, is there any room for free will? Can a country like Belarus ever truly break the mold, or will the slope of the riverbed always force it back to the east, regardless of who is sitting in the presidential palace?
That is the question. And looking at 2026, the answer seems to be that the river is still flowing the same way it has for a very long time.
Something to think about the next time you look at a map. It's not just lines on paper, it's the script for the future. Thanks for helping us unpack this deep dive.
Always a pleasure to explore the deep structures.
And thank you for listening. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the forces shaping our world. Keep exploring.